Right, I'm recording.
Yeah.
I'm talking about comics, right? Tonight.
You look blue on the screen.
No, right now I'm talking about comics. Let me talk about comics right now, right? Right now, okay? Okay. I was born in 1966, like, and I learnt how to read. And in the 1970s, when I was, from the age of about 7 or 8, I suppose.
Doesn't matter when you're born.
Look, can I just say what I'm saying first? Can I say what I'm saying? Yeah. In the early 1970s, we had there was comics. There's been comics since the 1930s actually, because Batman was probably the first comic, wasn't it? I suppose Batman. I suppose in America, Batman was the first comic. But I mean, you've had comic strips. We've had comic strips in newspapers since the 1800s, since Victorian times. No, actually, comics actually began. Comics.
1939.
Shut up, will you please? Shut up, and let me talk. I'm talking. I'm making a film. Hold on. Comics actually came out fucking in Victorian times, really, didn't they? Because
comics came out.
I'm talking about comics, Cash. Let me talk, right? Let me finish something when I'm saying something. Let me finish a sentence. I do not like people interrupting when I'm in the middle of a sentence. Can I make that point clear, Cash?
I couldn't get
Cash. You blabbering in. You sometimes you blabber in on a conversation. Yeah, but sometimes you blabber in on a conversation, right?
Comics came out.
No,
man.
Look, shut up. You're talking shit, Cash. Will you shut up?
Get to the bottom of it.
Cash, I'm asking you to shut the fuck up, all right, or go home.
Alright, fine.
All right? I'm asking you to shut the fuck up for a minute, all right? Yeah? Okay? Right. Okay, what I'm saying is newspapers didn't exist until about Victorian times. In Victorian times with Queen Victoria. Or maybe it might have been Georgian times. Actually, it might have been Georgian. It might have been before Queen Victoria. Because actually it wasn't until the 1800s that the printing press was invented. You know the printing press that prints the newspapers, yeah? I'm still talking about evolution and shit. But, you know the printing press that prints the newspapers? That wasn't invented until the 1800s. In the 1800s, the printing press was invented. Because we had the Industrial Revolution. Do you remember the Industrial Revolution? Do you know anything about history, Cash?
Mm-hmm.
Cash? Do you know anything about history?
Yes, I do.
All right. Do you know anything about the Industrial Revolution, right? In the Victorian times,
Yes,
yeah?
I do.
Okay. In Victorian times, they invented the printing... Well, they invented the...
No.
Shut up a minute. Wait a minute, let me finish. I can kick you out if I need have to. Let me just talk for a minute and let me just say my piece. You can say your piece afterwards, all right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, let me say my piece. Okay, we invented the
Can't get
printing...
upset about it or nothing.
Just let me just finish what I'm talking about, Cash. Shut up.
No, we have to be...
I'll go home, Cash, if you're going to be like that. Shut up. Shut up, please.
Being equal.
No! Shut up and let me finish what I'm talking about.
All right.
Or I'll send you home. You can go home if you want.
Fine.
It's only 20 to 11. No, stay there. But just let me talk what I'm saying. All right? Please? Yes? Okay, thank you. The printing press was invented during the Industrial Revolution in Victorian times. And that's the very, very first time that we ever had newspapers.
True.
In England. This is about England. Well, and America, I suppose. Well, no, England and America mainly.
No, Europe.
No, well, all right.
Wow.
All right, shut up. Just shut up, Cash. Let me say my bit first, please. You're annoying me now.
How am I annoying you?
Because you're not letting me say what I want to say.
I haven't said anything.
You keep talking. You have to keep talking when I'm trying to say something. Shut up.
All right.
Art of conversation. Let me finish a bloody sentence. Okay?
Excellent.
All right.
Do our conversation. Yeah.
Shut.
1 point.
Shut up or go home, Cash. Shut up or go home. Please. Printing presses were invented by human beings, not God, not this great Jesus Christ business or this Allah or whatever. God did not invent a printing press, did he? I didn't invent it. I know nothing about printing. For Christ's sake, I know nothing about printing. Fuck. A human being created a printing press, yes? Right. Industrial Revolution, right? Okay. And then we had newspapers. And when we had newspapers, we had news. You know, news facts, they're published. Newspapers were published quite a lot in the Industrial Revolution. So everyone got a newspaper every day in Victorian times, yeah? It was only in the Victorian times that people started getting newspapers, right? Now, okay. Every so often, cartoonists, they did one, used to draw, also in the newspapers there was news and there was cartoons as well. There was the occasional cartoon. Like they did the cartoon of Darwin saying that evolution doesn't exist.
Funkiness.
That there's no such thing as evolution. That is the truth. Do you remember Darwin? Have you ever heard of Charles Darwin? Now I'm talking to you. Right, have you ever heard of Charles Darwin?
Yeah.
Well, in the Victorian times,
Yeah.
Charles Darwin released a book called The Origin of Species, right? Okay, and cartoonists, anyway, they picked up on that idea, and they did a picture of
Yeah, monkey.
of Charles Darwin dressed as a monkey or something, and saying that Charles Darwin was mad. That how could human beings possibly evolve from apes? How ridiculous! The church is always right. I mean, yeah, but in Victorian times, Christianity was really big, right? It still is, and now, unfortunately, you know. But they took the piss out of Charles Darwin because Charles Darwin wrote a book about the evolution of man. Yeah, okay, right. Anyway, that's what, cartoons started appearing occasionally in newspapers in the late Victorian times. But anyway, in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century sort of thing, what actually happened was that a lot of cartoonists, a lot of people started drawing pictures, cartoons, for newspapers in the 1920s especially. Basically, sort of like cartoons became, well, but you always had cartoons occasionally in newspapers, I suppose. But they got really popular in the 1920s. And, that's why I got 40 quid in my pocket. People started drawing cartoons in newspapers, like Bob Kane, for instance, did Batman. You know, for instance, Batman started in a newspaper. And then comic in the 1930s, I think it was, probably about 1930s. DC and DC, I think it was DC Comics started it, didn't it? The comic revolution. The comic revolution basically began in the 1930s with DC Comics, and these were like comic books about superheroes for children. Yeah, comic books about superheroes for children. And what happened was that people like Bob Kane wrote stories like Batman and stuff. Anyway, so comic books became really popular in the 1930s. And the American comic books, like in America, I suppose Batman stuff like that. But anyway, I'm talking about Britain tonight. I'm not talking about America tonight. I'm talking about Britain. In Britain, basically in Britain, comics basically started in newspapers, in the British newspapers in Victorian times, basically. You know, you had the occasional comic strip. Don't ask me the history. You'd have to ask the historians about that. But comic books, basically, the comic strip in a newspaper in Victorian times. Anyway, in the 1950s, after the war, I think it was after the war, basically, we had real comics. That's when you had the comics really became popular after the Second World War. In fact, I don't know about America, but I don't know much about America, but I suppose comic books came over from America, really. The actual comic book, the actual principle of a comic book, because we used to have books and all that. Yeah, but the actual, and illustrations, things. But the actual idea of the comic book, basically, I suppose it came over from Australia when the GIs in World War II. Probably in World War II. It was probably in World War II when we were fighting Hitler. And the GIs came over with their comic books, didn't they, to Britain? During World War II. And they brought things like Batman and Superman to England, I suppose. That actually, I suppose England probably got Superman and Batman during World War II, when the GIs came over from America. Yeah. Okay. Right. Boom, boom, boom. Skip ahead a bit. All right. Okay. Anyway. Then then English comic books started, and there was things like there was Eagle. Eagle was the first. No, actually, I think it was basically. Football comics were very popular in the 1950s, I think. I think comics in Britain probably really became very popular. Sorry, comic books in Britain basically really became popular in about 1950s, I guess. Probably about 1950s. Because that was all these. That was basically the start of the comic book age. Basically, the comic book age. It was basically the 1950s, like, because you had things like the war. People started writing. In fact, probably I bet you a lot of the comic book writers. There was a lot of war comics in the 1950s in England. I'm talking about England, right? Specifically England. I don't know much about American history. I'm not American. I'm English. I'm British, right? I'm here. I'm in Hatfield, right? Anyway, in England, in Britain, basically, what I'm saying, comics became very popular in the 1950s because after the war, there were a lot of war comics, and I think actually a lot of the writers, probably in fact, I'd say definitely, really. A lot of the writers of the comic books in the 1950s were probably ex-soldiers. They're probably soldiers who wrote about their experiences during the wars or whatever. They used to keep... Because over history, a lot of people keep diaries, don't they? Over history, people keep diaries. Some people keep diaries over history. A lot of people keep diaries over history. So I suppose a lot of the comic books, the early 1950s comic books, were based on World War II experiences, weren't they? Because there were a lot of war comics in the 1950s. This is before my time, sort of thing. There were a lot of war comics in the 1950s. Like I think there was Eagle. There was I think there's sort of like late 50s. A lot of war comics. Battle. I think there was War. There was a comic book called War for children. These are comic books for children.
Propaganda and...
No, not propaganda. Actually.
Control.
No, not at all. In fact, I bet you anything you like, the most of the war comics in the 1950s were written by soldiers, ex-soldiers, who fought in World War II, right? Because there was a lot of World War II comics. Well, I don't know about a lot. There's two basically that I can remember, that I know of. Anyway, there was Battle, and there was, I think there was War. There was also Gus, I think, came out in the 50s. Was it Gus or something? No, I'm not an expert of the 50s. No, I'm not an expert in the 50s. I'm not an expert on comic books, right? But what I'm saying, a lot of comic books came out in the 50s about war. But it was basically soldiers teaching children about war, about the effects of war. In fact, Pat Mills, in the 1970s, I think, Pat Mills released, So in the 1960s, there was all these sort of like fashion magazines or whatever. I don't remember comic books much about. I don't know much about 1960s comic books. All right, really, I don't, because I was born in 1966 anyway. I was born in 1966, yeah. But I started but I think the comics basically started because a lot of soldiers had stories to tell about the Second World War. Because the Second World War was pretty big news in the 1930s. Was it 30s? In the 1930s, it was pretty big news. The Second World War was, because the whole world was at war.
39-45, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, when we had the world wars, it was pretty big in the newspapers. War was very big in newspapers, wasn't it? Because I mean, you had Disney in the 1920s and that's not the thing. I'm talking about comic books, not cartoons. Cartoons talk about some other time. But I'm talking about comic books. But yeah, and well, basically what happened was, I suppose a lot of soldiers wrote diaries and stuff like that, and what they did, they turned their memoirs into comic books. So they had stories to tell about the war. So they told lots of war stories in the 1950s, because these were the ex-soldiers, weren't they?
To remember what life is.
Yeah, but I'm just saying the writers in the 1950s, I guess, were the ex-soldiers who fought in World War II. So basically, they sort of wrote lots of war stories, yeah, about the tales of the war. So the children used to read the stories in comic books. You see, you see, as well as parents telling, because a lot of parents in the 50s were soldiers, yeah. In fact, most parents in the 50s were soldiers, or sailors, or airmen. In fact, we had conscription in World War II. So basically, almost everybody was a fucking soldier. Well, a hell of a lot of people were soldiers during World War II, right? So, anyway, cut a long story short, I think a lot of people wrote war stories in comic books in the 1950s to explain what happened during World War II. There was a lot of World War II stories, weren't there? But anyway, Eagle came out in the 60s. And Eagle had Dan Dare, you see. And Dan Dare was basically the first science fiction comic. No, it wasn't. Flash Gordon. I think Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers in America. In America, the first comic strip sort of science fiction heroes were things like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. So they made and then they turned the comic strips into the Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers TV series. Have you ever heard of Larry Buster Crab? Have you ever heard of Larry Crab? Buster Crab. He made TV serials in the 1930s, I think it was. In the 1930s, I think he made TV serials about Buck Rogers in the 21st. Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. Anyway, they came from comic books. Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon came from comic books originally, I think.
I like Buck Rogers.
Anyway, Eagle came out in the late 60s sort of thing, I think, and Jim knows in the 60s, in the early 60s, I think, or in the late 60s, 50s, 60s, in the 50s. I think Eagle started in the 50s. I'm not sure, but anyway, Jim. When I started reading comic books, I was about 7 or 8 years old. So I was talking about Star Trek anyway. Someone else talks about comics anyway. But about 7 or 8 years old, I suppose. And we used to go to the news every Friday. They used to come out every Friday. Comic books used to come out every Friday, right, when we were kids. I think I've made this bit about Whoopi and stuff. I've made this one already. I made the comic book one about Whoopi. But I'm talking about 2000 AD, yeah. Anyway, science fiction comic books. Like Pat Mills. Pat Mills brought out 2000 AD in the 80s, and that's on the YouTube as well, isn't it? But I actually used to read Star-Lord, actually, Pat, first, because I didn't read 2000 AD when it first came out. Because actually, originally, comic books cost about 10p and were released on newsprint. It was on newsprint paper, wasn't it? You know, like the same as newsprint paper. Anyway, then 2000 AD came out, and 2000 AD basically swallowed Star-Lord, you know, and all the characters came in. But anyway, I was saying about 2000 AD today. It was really big in the 1980s. It came out in the 1980s. I think 2000 AD came out. 2000 AD came out in the 80s. Pat Mills in the 80s, and it was really big in the 90s as well. And it was really good in the 90s as well. Because actually Star-Lord was a glossy comic. Do you remember Star-Lord? I started off with Star-Lord. Star-Lord was quite a glossy comic. You know, it was like very polished. You know, it was very. It wasn't on newsprint. It was on glossy paper. One of the first comics. Star-Lord was one of the first science fiction. One of the first comics to be science fiction comics to be put on glossy paper.
Oh, right.
But then it went back to newsprint when it joined with 2000 AD. Funny thing is, Star-Lord originally was on glossy paper, like magazines. It was on sort of magazine paper. Star-Lord was. But when it joined up with 2000 AD, it went back for a while. It went back to the newsprint paper for 2000 AD in the 1970s for quite a few years, you know. I think it wasn't until the late 80s, mid 80s, whatever, that 2000 AD got glossy. It started going glossy again, more like a magazine. But even the 1980s, it started off at 10p, it went up to 20p and 40p or whatever. In the 1980s, it cost about, I think, 50p. It was probably about 50p in the 1980s, 2000 AD was. And then when it went glossy, it went to £1. That's right. I think it went up to £1 when it went glossy in the 1990s, in the late 1980s, 1990s. And I got bored, and I loved it. It was really good. In the 1990s were fantastic. Because also 2000 AD, Pat Mills' company, they bought out Rogan Gosh, and no, this was in the late 80s actually. Rogan Gosh and Crisis as comic books, yeah. I'll tell you about them in a minute. But anyway, 2000 AD was really good in the 90s. It was great in the 90s, but after the year 2000, it got really fucking boring. The stories just got really, really dull. And the price is now £3.50. It's not worth £3.50 because the stories are crap these days, I think. But it's brilliant in the 1990s. 2000 AD was fantastic in the year 2000s. Sorry, 1990s, because that's when I came back from Australia in 1990. In the 90s, it was fantastic, 2000 AD. But anyway, in 1989, they released the first gay comic books in Britain. I know America had gay comics. I think it was called gay comics in America. They had gay comics. They owned gay comic strips in America. But in the 89, two comic books came out, Crisis and Revolver. And Crisis had a story. They only lasted for about a year or two. I think about a year. Crisis and Revolver only lasted for about a year. Because obviously nobody bought the comics. You know, when comics started dying out, I guess. Yeah, but, you know, comics were sort of started dying out. I mean, 2008 is still going. I suppose Beano's still going. A few others are, maybe. But what I'm saying is, in 1989, I'm talking about my comic book history, Crisis and Revolver came out. And there were gay comic books. They had gay characters in them. In fact, they only lasted about 6 months, I think. Probably about 6 months, maybe a year. We only had gay comic books for about a year. Maybe 6 months. Maybe only 6 months. In about about a year. 89 and 1990. That's right, it was 1989. No, yes it was. Yes it was. We had gay comic books 1989 and 1990. Because the first gay characters, I used to work in a shoe shop and Dickens Jones, you know. Anyway, when Crisis and Revolver were released in 1989, and that's when I actually they were the very first gay comic books, and I really loved them. I absolutely adored them, because for the first time I could relate to something gay. In the 89, I was relate to something in the gay comic in comic books, because you had Burgess and Dalton were new states in Crisis. In Crisis, you had the New Statesman, where there were these super powered characters. There was these superhumans, gay superheroes. They had a gay superhero called Dalton in Crisis. Dalton. They had a great gay superhero in Crisis called Dalton, and he was in the New Statesman. Called called Dalton. Yeah,
Dalton, yeah.
and there was Burgess.
Tomato.
Burgess was a bisexual. You see,
Dig it.
Burgess was bisexual. They're both, had superpowers of some kind. Superpowers, and they're the very first English gay superheroes kind of thing. In fact,
Is that you?
I think Burgess was Australian or New Zealand, something like that. But anyway, I don't know. But anyway, that was great. New Statesman. It only lasted about 6 months. We only had the New Statesman for 6 months in Crisis. In Crisis, yeah. That was a brilliant story. And we had Revolver for about 6 months, which was also had a gay character, Rogan Gosh. Do you know about Rogan Gosh? He was a Carmanaut. You see, Rogan Gosh was a Carmanaut. He worked at Curry House, but he was actually a blue dude. He was like a Krishna character. He was like Harry Krishna. Totally fucking trippy. The trippiest fucking comic ever I've ever seen is Revolver. It was in 1989 and 1990. Because in 1990 I was in Australia. I was in Australia in 1990. I started reading it in 1989, so it must have been going on for about 2 years. It might have gone on for a couple of years. It went on for 89 and 1990, right? Because I was reading it when I was working in Carvella, saving up to go to Australia. Because I was working in a shoe shop and in Dickens and Jones, Carvella Shoes, Bill Bailey. Do you remember Bill Bailey in Carvella Shoes, 1990, stockroom controller? Carvella Shoes. I remember my girls. I had loads of girlfriends in the 1990s. I used to read my poetry in Carvella Shoes, by the way. Carvella Shoes and the shop next door, Dickens and Jones, 1980s, 1988, 87, 88, 89. No, I was there for 5 years actually. I used to work in Carvella Shoes for 5 years actually, 1985.
Really?
1985 to about 1990, I worked in Carvella Shoes before I went to Australia. And all the girls in Carvella Shoes and there was a shop next door as well, a shoe shop next door, I can't remember what they were called. But they used to read, all the girls, they loved reading my poetry. I used to write poetry. I've been writing poetry for about 40 years. Most of my life I've been writing poetry. But I used to write poetry I've been writing poetry most of my life. But I used to write a lot of poetry in the 1980s. In the 1980s I wrote a lot of poetry. But my girlfriends in Carvella Shoes and the shoe shop next door in Dickens and Jones, I was a stock boy. I was the stockroom boy, and they used to love reading my poetry. They used to take I used to give them my. But I had a whole book of poetry. My first book, it was a book of poetry. It was. I've still got it in a box. I've still got all the poems in a box, which needs sorting out, by the way. I need someone who can sort poetry and stuff out. I've got boxes loads of poetry in the other room, by the way. I've got boxes loads of fucking poetry in the living room, in the other room, by the way. But anyway, in Carvella Shoes, they used to read my poetry, and they used to love my poetry. I loved that. They were fantastic. I used to write poetry, and the girls in Carvella Shoes and Dickens and Jones, they used to read my poetry. It was brilliant. Anyway, I was talking about Rogan Gosh, and that was carried on when I was in Australia. Because when I was in Australia, when I started taking LSD, you see, because Rogan Gosh got me interested in the drug culture. Because actually, Rogan Gosh, it was Brendan McCarthy. It might have been Brendan McCarthy, I think it was. Rogan Gosh was it was Jim Balky. Jim Balky, I think, wrote in the New Statesman with somebody else. I can't remember who else it was. But I think it was Brendan McCarthy who wrote the Rogan Gosh. And it was about this blue Carmanaut. It was a gay sort of Carmanaut who travelled the trippy world. Travelled a world of LSD and stuff, and it was really trippy. And I totally tripped out on that on LSD on one day, I'll tell you that. I totally tripped out on Rogan Gosh when I was on LSD. It was a beautiful comic. By the way, comics, you don't get gay comics these days, do you? We only had gay comics for about 2 years in 1989 and 1990. In 1989 we had Rogan Gosh and the New Statesman, and they're the only gay comics we ever really had in England, really. Well, apart from the ones obviously there are gay comics now. I'm certain you can buy gay comic books in Trowell and whatever. There are a lot of gay comic books now in the gay shops. Yeah, you can buy gay comic books in gay shops now. Yes, you can buy gay comic books. It's the year 2016, and yes, you can buy gay comic books in gay shops, but you're not allowed to go into a gay shop until you are 18, you see. You're not actually allowed to go into a gay shop, and like Prowler, for instance, in London, you're not allowed to go into a gay shop until you're 18 to buy a gay comic book. But when I was when I was about 1989, I'm at, hold on, 66, 76, 86. I was about 23, 24. When I was 23 and 23 or 24, I used to buy comic books, which anyone could buy. Crisis or Revolver. There was no age restriction on Crisis or Revolver, funnily enough. You could have bought that at any age. But I used to buy Crisis and Revolver every week, and that was great fun. Anyway, that's about comics.